Hello everyone, and welcome to the 4th episode of Analyzing Benevolence, featuring the first of the 9 protagonists from the manga JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Jonathan Joestar. While I already have gotten a couple of requests for Jonathan, truth be told, that isn't the reason I'm actually covering him, as the real reason is that I'm a huge fan of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure as a whole, and the characters and philosophy of the series. And while I could just make a single video based on Jonathan, or just any of the other JoJo's in the series and then call it a day, my plan is that I'm going to do a video on every single protagonist that has appeared within JoJo's Bizarre Adventure thus far. And then some. It won't be something I'll do within the next couple months, especially considering I'm planning on waiting on Jonathan Joestar for when JoJo Lands is finished, plus I haven't actually read it yet, if I'm going to be completely honest. Instead, the videos on the first 8 Joestars will likely be within the next year or two, and will come out relatively gradually depending on how I feel in between each release. However, with that out of the way, let's get started on the one who started it all, Jonathan Joestar. Born in Britain during 1868 to the rich and highly respected Joestar family and a kind mother and father, Jonathan's upbringing was only looking positive from where it was being perceived to be going. Unfortunately, while he still would have a mostly positive childhood, this trajectory was affected when the family got into a horrible carriage accident, killing the driver and mother. Arguably worse though, a local thief and notorious drunk, Dario Brando, came by the carriage to rob them, only for Jonathan's father, George Joestar I, to assume that he was only trying to save them, which would lead to the eventual adoption of Dio Brando, kickstarting not only the events that would transpire in Jonathan's life, but the life of every Joestar that would follow as a whole. As previously mentioned though, Jonathan's childhood would still remain mostly positive despite his lack of a mother figure in his life, at least in comparison to Dio's. It is shown that Jonathan still does seem to miss his mother, however, such as a scene where he mourns over her while looking at a painting of her, or how he went into archaeology in the first place due to study the ways of the mask, which was something that his mother was interested in. Before the events of this series, however, it can be argued, and let me put this into perspective, argued in all caps, that Jonathan was something akin to a spoiled child. Even though Jonathan Joestar would later be seen by his peers as an ultimate gentleman, something we'll get more into later, he did have his moments of outbursts and rudeness when he was younger. The most early example of this was back when he initially got Danny as a 5-year-old. After he got bitten by him, he would tease and threaten Danny, such as throwing rocks at him. Eventually though, this behavior would stop when Jonathan was once drowning and Danny saved him. With Jonathan now having a new appreciation and love for Danny, and even being Jonathan's own way to cope with the lack of a mother. Besides this though, there's also this really weird line that Jonathan has about spinning around frogs for fun when he's talking to Arena, like by their legs with a string. Like, what the fuck are you talking about, John? Though honestly, besides these two scenes, it's kind of debatable how spoiled Jonathan actually was. Like, I bring it up primarily because it's something that George Joestar addresses to Jonathan during the dinner scene, but even then it's like, is he really being bad? Like, yeah, he's being slightly rude with how he's quickly eating and spilling things, but like, Then there's also this one scene where Jonathan seriously munches on his chocolate like a madman. Now, this is especially not an example of him being flawed, but also this panel was so entertaining to me that I felt a deep need to include it in the video somehow. I'm sorry. Then there's also the one scene where he's beating Dio to an absolute pulp despite technically being an opponent he's already beaten, which, like, yeah, I guess that's true. But also you have to remember that Dio is the closest thing this world has to a literal incarnate of evil. And I mean, this was right after he just, I don't know if I could say that word, Jonathan's girlfriend earlier, and plus, like, I mean, seeing Dio cry is really funny, I'm not gonna lie. I did also remember while writing this that there was a scene where Jonathan did punch one kid who he was just calling him a snitch, and that was pretty much it. But even then, yeah, it's not really that bad either, so whatever. But in terms of flaws, that's pretty much all that Jonathan has. Something he did when he was 5 years old out of fear, a random throwaway line, and actions he did that would only really offend a 19th century aristocrat and basically no one else. I guess you can say that he was kind of snobbish, though this is a trait that is nowhere near the same level as Dio's display of snobbishness. And also, I'd argue that this is practically non-existent in his later years. So, what's the point here? But while Jonathan's life was very much a positive experience for the young lad, George Joestar was a little bit too harsh on Jonathan when he was growing up, especially when Dio came into the picture. This isn't to say he was abusive, and he very much was a loving father, but he often was critical towards Jonathan for even small things that didn't matter much in the long run. However, even when considering this, it's kind of hard to argue with the results, as even though George Joestar was oftentimes too disciplinary for his own good towards his son, it still contributed to Jonathan becoming Jonathan's acts of politeness are almost comical with how far he's willing to go just to follow basic decency of his environment. Probably the most prevalent example is when he defends Arena Pendleton from two bullies and gets beat up for doing so. Then the two remark about how they are hoping he isn't from the Joestar family as they hate rich boys, as they put it. Only for him to pull out a cloth with his name on it, for him to get beaten up even more. It's a pretty corny scene. However, it does show that even in moments where it's very obviously not to his benefit to do something, he's willing to do it for what is considered polite by society, such as wiping himself using the handkerchief to wipe the blood and dirt off himself. Other instances are like how he admits that he was only really focused on saving Arena Pendleton, primarily just to do the gentlemanly thing of saving a woman in distress, rather than simply trying to get her approval. This is why Arena Pendleton ended up falling in love with Jonathan in the first place, actually, as during their wedding day, this is what she directly referenced as the thing that made her fall in love with him in the first place. As it's such an odd but noble thing for him to do, it just automatically stands out in comparison to everyone else. Then there's when he gets into a fight with Speedwagon, where he held back on his action due to his reluctance to hurt him and possibly make his family sad, which in turn makes Speedwagon dedicate himself to Jonathan out of sheer admiration towards the man and his acts of good. Or like how again, with Arena when she is tending to him with her almost passing out, only for Jonathan to catch her, which just as a reminder, Jonathan's arm was still broken, and he's been in bed for days on end after having his entire body broken after just waking up. All of this, of course, comes from his upbringing as George Joestar's son, and being the one who was raised by the man who was willing to forgive a man who stole from him, simply because he saw him as the man who was trying to save him. This can actually be argued as the greatest flaw of both Jonathan and George, their desire to see the best in people, often to the major disadvantage of their own self to the point of being taken advantage of, which reminds me of the next section of this video. Dio is an asshole who ruined Jonathan's life. I don't think it takes a genius philosopher to make that statement. In the first day or two of the two meeting, he kicks a dog, humiliates him in front of his father, basically forces Jonathan to bet all of his allowance, humiliates him in front of all of his friends and spreads rumors, steals his first kiss, then burns his dog alive. Now, he does chill out after this, but it wasn't because he felt bad for hurting him, but rather simply just so he didn't get caught for his very obvious intentions. This kinda ended up being an almost genius decision, however, as this basically ended up causing Jonathan to be so confused about the sudden shift in behavior that he essentially gaslights himself into believing that none of it even happened in the first place. But that doesn't stop him from feeling hatred towards Dio, which he ends up berating himself over even feeling that stuff in the first place. Hence, him seeing the best in people, as I mentioned beforehand. Of course, he did have every right to feel those things. Hell, even if Dio wasn't evil, it's still normal to feel emotions, even if they aren't exactly what's considered acceptable emotions by general society. And personally, this is something that I struggle with myself, so I understand where he's coming from here. But regardless, it's never a good idea to suppress these feelings, as it will eat you up from the inside and cause emotional issues. Of course, there's the opposite issue, of Dio in particular feeling nothing but hate and wanting to embrace it both before he was a vampire and after his transformation, and this was causing issues as his intentions were blatantly becoming more and more clear. Both ironically go through a semi-character arc related to these issues. Dio becomes significantly better at hiding his hatred and manifesting it in a way to charm and manipulate others to his whim, something he practically masters in Part 3. Jonathan, however, learns to manifest his hatred in a way to help others. While he still does sort of keep his emotions more or less to himself, and more so shows them when appropriate, such as when he's battling Dio and his many zombies, he's willing to point out the guilt that he feels over having to fight such opponents, however still does do it for the greater good of humanity, not criticizing himself for feeling that way, just acknowledging it. His Amon training is also the perfect way I'd argue that Jonathan is able to manifest his anger and emotions in a way that's healthy. And I'd also argue that's what gives him his power to begin with. When Speedwagon asks Apelli why he isn't able to learn Haman, he responds with, "Even now, JoJo keeps up the breathing method I taught him. It's not easy keeping a special breathing unconsciously at all times, night and day, awake and sleep. Only 1 in 10,000 have the attitude, and JoJo has incredible willpower created by the sad past and heavy future he carries on his back." Now, to bring up the obvious, if you've never read or seen JoJo, you might be wondering what Haman even is. And you may also wonder why I mentioned this idea of Dio becoming a vampire, as these aren't really elements I fully explained the context to. A lot of the time, these elements aren't really that important to the story. For example, in the last video, I didn't really mention that Superman used hypno glasses or gained energy from the sun in order to make my point on who Clark Kent is. But in order to explain who Jonathan is, we need to talk about Haman, vampirism, and the duality of life itself. Within Part 1 and 2, there are two dual forces that are in a battle with one another: the stone masks and the undead, and Haman. While the vampires and zombies are a representation of death and the absence of humanity, Haman, on the other hand, is the representation of life and humanity's perseverance, and is the representation of life flowing through the body itself and into the environment. This isn't me just coming up with random theories either. This is something that is repeatedly stated as a theme throughout all of the entire part, that Haman is a representation of life, and how it is the counter to vampirism itself. So, there honestly isn't much to analyze to talk about what Haman is exactly or what it represents, even if I'm not sure how accurately I got the details here, as it still is hard for me to personally explain, so sorry to anyone if I explained it improperly. However, what is worth talking about is why humanity is important in this way from a thematic standpoint. On the author's note for the very first volume, Araki has stated that, "Put simply, this work is about what it means to live. I want to examine two ways of living through the two main characters. By depicting the conflict between humans and inhuman creatures, I aim to sing an ode to humanity. This work was made for your enjoyment, and I hope you like it." This information, of course, came from the JoJo Wiki. Thank you very much, JoJo Wiki. I appreciate it. This isn't the only time that Araki has addressed this being the theme of JoJo's either. As you can see here, he reestablishes that the point of JoJo is the strength and spirit and the perseverance of mankind. Continuing on this theme of perspective, William has a monologue that very much falls under this line of thinking as well, comparing humans and fleas, and what it truly means to be brave, and that within this context of having fear, but still pursuing forward anyway. This also continues even further with the common theme that a truly evil person is insanely rare to the actual population, and that most people have some form of good within them, as Dio states. Or when how Bruford gets fully entranced in the ripple energy, he finally enters a state of peace, and how feeling joy, pain, etc. is all proof of life. Honest to God, there are probably other things I'm missing, and this isn't even to include every other single part that has come after Phantom Menace. So what does this theme of humanity have to do with Jonathan? Well, I believe that Jonathan Joestar is the embodiment of what it truly means to be human. Let me explain. When Dio becomes a vampire, he says the very iconic line, "I reject my humanity!" Now, this, of course, has become something of a meme. Well, no, it has literally become a meme. But okay, think about what he's saying here. Obviously, he is literally rejecting humanity in order to become a vampire of the beyond. But in the process, he is fully willing to give up pain, grief, sadness, all of what we consider normal human emotions for the sake of power and prosperity. Dio is the ultimate example of something that isn't human, and Jonathan still remains Dio's opposite. Therefore, if Dio represents death and the inhuman, Jonathan is what it means to be human at its fullest extent. To be scared, to be brave, to be hateful, to be filled with love, to be filled with grief, to embody life. All of these things are what it means to be human, and all of these things are what Haman represents as a whole. So, with this in mind, it's also important to note that Jonathan was able to gain the amazing abilities of Haman within a single day. Now, sure, technically Joseph does become better at him when it comes to literal skill. However, Joseph had an entire month of hellish training just to earn the upper limits of his skills. Jonathan earned his power by sheer natural giftedness and ability, because he already represented life, love, and humanity to begin with. Though, there is a question. What happens if one who represents life and humanity itself dies? At the end of Phantom Blood, after Jonathan beats Dio, he reunites with Irina, and the two get married with a honeymoon trip to America. Of course, though, Dio ended up surviving, and shows up planning to steal Jonathan's body for himself. Despite this, though, Dio talks about how he has a strange love for Jonathan, and how the two were literally fated to be enemies, and how despite being the incarnate of evil, he actually plans on making Jonathan's death as painless as possible out of respect for him. The two end up in a fight, and while Jonathan actually does make a difference, it does seem to be leaning more towards Dio's favor. He does, however, plan to make one more move, as he uses the rest of his Haman to turn the zombie henchmen of Dio into a way to hold onto the ship to explode, so both he and Dio can be sunk into the middle of the ocean, with him telling for Irina to get out of there, only for her to just say that she'll stay. That is, until the two notice a lost baby on the ship, reminding Jonathan of his own mother and how she protected him when she died, and begs Irina to leave with the baby and use the coffin that Dio brought in order to stay alive. As Dio makes one last move to try and steal Jonathan's body to escape, Jonathan ends up stopping him, but tells him that he feels a strange connection to Dio much like how he does, and how even if their fates are intertwined, they will both vanish into the ocean, before he tells Irina to live and continue being happy. Dio then once again tries to convince Jonathan to let him live and that it'll help Jonathan be with Irina forever, but it doesn't matter anymore, as Jonathan Joestar died on February 7th, 1889. From here, Jonathan's impact on the overarching story becomes much more distant. On a literal level, he was the reason that every JoJo came to be, as it turned out that Irina was actually pregnant around that time as well. There's also other impacts that Jonathan would inadvertently have on the series, however these wouldn't really come into play until part 3, 5, and 6, which I won't go into detail about due to risk of spoilers just in case anyone watching hasn't reached those parts yet. I will say though, from a thematic standpoint, Jonathan left a greater impact on the series than possibly any other character. The idea of Jonathan is something that has been passed down to each Joestar in the bloodline. I won't lie, every JoJo from here is flawed to a massive degree, whether they be a cheater, a mediocre dad, a scam artist thief, a mobster, or even just a rebellious petty criminal. They all have one thing in common, and that's regardless on their flaws, they all have in common the blood of Jonathan Joestar, his goodness, his bravery, his love, and most importantly, his humanity. So, who was Jonathan Joestar? He was a man who went through tragedy as a young boy, a boy who, like any other, had some issues when they were young, however grew out of them due to strict parenting from his father, before eventually meeting his adopted brother Dio, who would traumatize him and fill him with hate and sadness. And while for many years he held back this sadness for the sake of polite society, he was able to manifest it for the good of all of mankind, all the while remaining a perfect gentleman who felt remorse even to his enemies and those who caused him pain. And even after his death, he was able to inspire a legacy of greatness and benevolence. Thank you everyone who's still watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it a lot. I just finished editing this video, and right now I am recording the outro, which obviously I still need to make the outro, but here you go, this is the outro. Our patrons for today are only Carlos, like last week, as well as Saint Valentine for this week as well. So thank you to everyone who is supporting thus far. The shoutout for this week is The Quills Archive, a friend of mine who recently made a new video related to the Batman and how it would fit perfectly into the new DC universe. I haven't actually seen the new video, not gonna lie. It's just, I've been very busy, but you'll see a comment of me over there saying, hey, what's up, it's me, a silly fellow, blah, all that jazz. But either way, people have been wanting more DC content with people requesting for the Batman. Well, there you go, more Batman content. Hope you enjoy. I apologize if this one's a little bit rusty as well. I think I want to do every single one of these outros with like a little bit of amateurness to them, to add a bit of personality to the video, though then again I feel like the video might already have enough personality, but more personality never hurts, unless it's like during really depressing moments or whatever, but whatever, that's besides the point. Support my Patreon if you have the funds, and if you want to see more content quicker, give the video a like, a subscribe, maybe a suggestion in the comments. Anything helps, really. Anyway, though. Oh, damn it. I can't believe I almost forgot this. 1,000 subscribers. That shit means a lot, you know? Like, I guess I had a feeling I would get there, but still it's like, huh, you actually got there. Weird, you know? It's good to see that this is starting to pay off at least a little bit, and I'm more excited to do things like this in the future. More videos, more ideas, whatever. And that's pretty much it. That's pretty much all I have to say, other than just thank you. It's hard to say thank you so many times, but just thank you. And hope you have a lovely day. Thank you.